Today's topic will be wrongful conviction. Hi, welcome back. Today's topic is wrongful conviction. So we're talking about what that entails, what the causes of wrongful conviction are, and what the impacts of wrongful conviction are. There are several leading causes of wrongful convictions. Now, we're not going to discuss an exhaustive list today, but we will discuss some of the leading causes and some that should have more attention given to them. At the top of the list is eyewitness identification errors. Now, eyewitnesses tend to be the leading cause of wrongful convictions, folks. This type of error is one of the primary contributors, unfortunately, for wrongful convictions. In fact, according to many, it was the contributing cause in over 70% of convictions overturned through DNA testing. Now, eyewitnesses, as we know, can be unreliable, and that's for a variety of reasons. These eyewitnesses are normally under extreme amounts of stress, experiencing emotions, lighting difficulties or distance issues play an effect here, and even memory recall. And the problem is that the public tends to know very little about the dangers of relying on this type of evidence, and they place a lot of confidence in it. And so the issue is that it creates a problem in trials because juries, as we know, are made up of people from the public. So the other issue to be aware of is that there is a cross-rate effect, and this tends to add to the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. So studies have examined this cross-race effect, and it's shown, I believe, almost 1.5 times more likely to remember and correctly identify the face of an individual who has the same race as he or she, as compared to their ability to remember and identify the face of someone, for example, of a different racial group. Now, eyewitness testimony is a good example as a contributing factor. We're not going to discuss a list of individuals per se, but you can easily find that with reliable sources and some quick research, guys. Secondly, we're going to look at false confessions. That's a big one, when the innocent admit guilt. And you might say, well, how does that happen, or why does that happen? Why would somebody ever admit to something that they didn't do? A confession is seen to be a very powerful evidence of guilt. And that's why false confessions can easily lead to a conviction. And in this case, it would be a wrongful conviction. People are unwilling to believe that someone who has confessed to a crime, as I said, did not actually commit that crime. And yes, folks, it does happen actually quite regularly. No rules which have been legislated, which would create procedures, for example, for interviewing adults that would guard against false confessions currently exist. And the only safeguard really against having false confessions used in court by the prosecution is the judge. And he or she has the power to refuse to allow the confession into evidence. Now, the problem is even the courts are reluctant to exclude confessions obtained under very intense interrogations. And, this includes confessions made by individuals who have significant mental health issues and or intellectual abilities. All right, guys. So the third is considered as Mr. Big. Now, this is a legal slang. It refers to police who trick innocent people into confessing. Now, the Mr. Big sting is a very controversial undercover operation. It was developed in the 90s here in Canada. And while the practice is actually banned in other countries like the US and even Britain, the practice is still here in use in Canada, and from what I understand, still in Australia. Now, police officers will spend weeks and months undercover learning as much as they can about the suspect, and they will want to learn things like their habits, where they spend their time. And after they've gathered that type of information, the police will set up, a very elaborate fake criminal operation. And in order to lure their suspect into the gang, one would be tasked with befriending that person. And, in the final step of the process, the head of the gang, which is known as Mr. Big, asks for a confession into the crime as proof of loyalty to the organization. And usually that comes with the promise of helping them prove innocence to the crime by having, another member of the gang confess. Now, confessing to, Mr. Big appears to have no consequences to the suspect, who may have also been threatened, causing them to fear for their safety. And that often will entice them even further to confess, folks. So the pressure of falsely confessing to Mr. Big, as they refer to in the legal industry, can be a key reason of wrongful conviction in many cases. Another thing to be aware of is false guilty pleas. This is when the innocent bargain for their freedom. And guilty pleas and plea bargaining are often cited as being really necessary in our criminal justice system to work properly and in a timely, effective manner. In fact, the vast majority of cases brought to trial end in plea bargains. And some estimates put that number, over 90% and sometimes over 95% in trial cases. Now, it seems difficult to understand and wrap our mind around why a person who's innocent would, plead guilty to a crime, similar to what we discussed earlier. However, there are really a lot of reasons that people consider taking a plea deal. Sometimes you're facing a prospect of life in prison if you're convicted of murder, and an accused might decide to accept a reduced sentence or a lesser charge like manslaughter. A convincing and a compelling eyewitness or expert testimony could lead the accused to believe that they would not convince the jury of their innocence. And so they're often, in a situation where they feel that their odds would be better if they accepted this deal. Now, there are several examples, as I said, people who have been sent to jail for crimes that they did not commit. Crown prosecutors, have called witnesses and or planned, as I say, to call certain witnesses as key witnesses, and that tends to scare individuals into taking these plea deals. Okay. The other thing to consider, which is fairly common in the legal industry in terms of awareness, is tunnel vision. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, this is focusing on one suspect to the exclusion of everybody else. Tunnel vision really is what it sounds like. It's focusing, honing in on just one particular person, one particular area. And that's a really big problem under the umbrella of what we call professional misconduct. And it can be defined as a single-minded and, as I said, overly narrow focus on a particularly investigative or prosecutorial theory, so as to unreasonably cover the evaluation of information, for example, received, and one's conduct in response to that. So in some cases, police and prosecutors will seek evidence that fits their theory, as opposed to developing a theory based on existing evidence, which is what should be happening. Police and prosecutors affected by this tunnel vision, they don't necessarily have bad intentions, not all the time. They always, it's not a sense that they don't necessarily realize sometimes, guys, that they're suffering from this, sinister effect, as we say. But pressure to solve a crime and to ensure that the perpetrator, the right perpetrator, is brought to justice does tend to increase that psychological phenomenon. Tunnel vision has played a significant role in several wrongful convictions, guys. And as I say, we're not going to focus on those, but a very quick search of academic sources will give you an extensive idea of what we're talking about. The next discussion is regarding the evolution of and errors in forensic science. Now, the conflict in our justice system's quest for finality and the ever-changing nature of science is something to be mentioned. Now, as we know, DNA was not actually as an analysis introduced into our Canadian criminal justice system until the 80s, and that has really helped exonerate many people at the end of the day who are innocent. The results of forensic analysis techniques such as hair identification, bite mark comparisons, we're talking about firearm tool analysis, shoe comparisons here, folks, blood typing, they were accepted as, reliable early on, and now they're under increased forms of scrutiny. Many have been found to be unreliable and, of course, inadmissible as evidence in court. Reliable forensic techniques are still subject to human interpretation and identification. So there's always potential for error. When we talk about hair microscopy, there is evidence to be seen in the case of James Driscoll. So if you are going to research cases after, as we're not spending, as I say, a whole lot of time there, this is a good case to refer to. It was argued in his case that 3 hairs were found in his van, which matched those of the victim in the case. And it suggested that James had forced the victim into his vehicle, which then he took to the site of the murder. Now, DNA testing later revealed that hairs were thought to be the victims were actually not. So again, if you're looking to look at hair microscopy evidence, you should look up James Driscoll.
Stay tuned for part 2.